Good evening. This is Michael Lilborn Williams coming to you live from above my sister's garage in the bonus room right here in East Tennessee. Rainy East Tennessee, still chilled East Tennessee. Goodness, March has come, spring has come, but somebody forgot to notify the weather. Maybe I'm still going through South Florida withdrawals. Who knows? Anyway, we are very glad that you joined us here today, regardless of how cool it is outside this evening. Tonight, you're not going to get a report on the coronavirus. You're not going to get told what to do, what not to do. It's time for some good news, and that good news is found in the gospel. We're going to pick up where we were 3 weeks ago. And we were going through these verses in Colossians, and then I had the interruption of doing the one session after returning from Canada on Paul's testimony in Philippians. So I'm going to try to get back on track here, and we'll go on down through this. And you guys stay safe. Just do what you know to do, and we're all going to come through this just fine. All right. We're going to pick back up again. These verses are so explosive with Christ. They are so revealing of Christ and what Jesus has done and how he has done it and who he is. I love this part in verse 16 that says that he's far above all principalities and powers and mights and dominions. It simply means that Jesus is far beyond all rank and all jurisdiction. There's no rank that he doesn't outrank, and there's no jurisdiction that his jurisdiction doesn't go further than that. That's just a real good picture for your mind, and that's what we're talking about here. Paul is focusing in on, now that we've been redeemed, now that the entire world has gone through this amazing thing that God has done, this thing called reconciliation. Now that we've all been reconciled unto God, this is what you got to deal with. Because what's happened is a very sad state of affairs. We've read through here how that God has declared peace through the cross. That was verse 21, and having made peace through his blood, through the blood of his cross by himself to reconcile all that peace that, I just saw a little glitch. I'm hoping you're still there. That peace that was acquired by Christ between God and man is absolutely powerful. But you see, that peace is not being taught in the vast majority of Christian denominations. They still think God's angry about something. They still think God, if you do something wrong, God's going to get you. They still teach and preach that in this life or the next life, there's some punishment coming. And that just is a lie. It is totally against what Paul preached as the gospel of peace. And so there's been peace declared. There's this powerful universal understanding that there is now no longer an angry God, that the things that you read in the Old Testament are not true in the New Testament. But isn't there a new covenant? And this covenant is called the covenant of peace. That's what Isaiah called it. So I just can never emphasize this enough, that our minds need to be renewed from this angry God concept. There's actually people saying that what's going on right now is somehow some judgment from God. But that just is not true. I'm going to sit here tonight and tell you that every person that has told you that this current situation is a judgment of some kind of God upon the earth or America for this reason or that reason is a lie. I've done it every time this has happened, and I would intend to do it again. And if God's punishing and judging somebody, shouldn't he judge me right now for saying that it's not the judgment of God? If God's trying to get a point across by judging people and I'm telling them it's not true, that I should be the number one target of right now. It's like, don't let me live another second. I'm still here. Oh my goodness, guys. I tell you, I'm so confident in the gospel of peace. Yes, I can even act silly like that. I'm absolutely confident of the peace that was acquired for us at the cross of Jesus Christ, even as Paul is telling us here. Now, he goes on into verse 21, and you who were sometimes alienated and enemies in your minds by wicked works, now yet hath he reconciled. He's saying now, even though you still feel alienated in your mind, even though those doctrines are still there, even though that mindset is still there, I can assure you, you've been reconciled. That this is all just a mind thing, and this was the crux of the matter when Paul was teaching about the renewing of the mind and the saving of the soul. Not getting born again or any of those things is not what Paul was talking about in the renewing of the mind. He means now, just as he taught in Philippians, in his testimony, he said, what I'm saying, it makes perfect sense to those that are perfect. But you got to know that you're perfect first for it to make perfect sense. Then when you understand your perfection in Christ, you now have a concept, a framework within which to think. But if you've never been told flat out, God is not angry with anyone, you see, your concepts can be changed in a moment through one sermon. Somebody standing up and saying, well, God not happy. Well, I'm beg to differ. God is happy. How could he be happy? What's going on? God is happy with what happened through Christ. What is wrong with you guys that set aside the cross and try to define the gospel without the cross? To try to define God without the cross. You can't define God without the cross because God decided to define himself through the work of the cross. But you hath he reconciled. It doesn't make any difference what happens in your mind. It doesn't make any difference how far your mind thinks God is mad. It doesn't make any difference how bad you think things are between you and God. It's all in your head because there's something called the cross that has reconciled all of this. It has been not being reconciled. It has been reconciled. So now Paul's got us on a really good understanding here, and we're going to proceed in this mindset that what Paul is talking about is getting rid of the mindset and getting a mindset that goes along with reconciliation. That's what a renewed mind is. You see, if God reconciled everyone, as Paul is saying here, it's what he just said, then we have to acquire a mindset that agrees with that. If God has made you perfect, you have to have a mindset that agrees with that. And I'm guarantee you, I'm just so sorry to tell you that all of Christianity that I'm aware of does not agree with that basic Pauline principle of the fact that God has reconciled all things unto himself. They just don't agree. Why don't they agree? Because they read Peter, James, and John. What does Peter, James, and John say? Sin still exists. Judgment still exists. Jesus is coming back on a white horse and judge everybody that doesn't believe. And judgment is still in the world, and you still have to keep the law to be righteous. Sorry, but that is what they taught. And that was the big disagreement with Paul. So here, let's stay in context with this for just a little while. He says, in the body of his flesh through death to present you holy and unblameable and unreprovable in his sight. Now, Paul, and then the next verse says, if you continue in the faith. Now, what is this predicated upon? If you continue in the faith. Now, we know which faith he's talking about. He's not talking about people's faith. Paul always said he was redeemed by the faith of the Son of God. Why does Paul get to be redeemed by the faith of the Son of God and I got to be redeemed by my own faith? All right. So if you continue in the faith. Now, what's going to happen if you continue in the faith? Let me finish the verse. Rooted and grounded, continue in the faith, grounded and settled, being not moved away from the hope of the gospel which you have heard and which was preached to every creature under heaven. Now, Paul is not, this is not some, wait a minute, Paul just brought up a subject he's never talked about. Paul said on numerous occasions that the gospel has already been preached to every creature. Paul said this on several occasions. He said it in Romans that the gospel had already gone out into the whole world. That's what Paul had to say, and that word world there means cosmos. Paul had a concept that the effect of the gospel had already gone out into the whole world. The effect of the work of the cross had gone out into all the world. And Paul acknowledged, you've heard it, but he says, you got to understand it's gone out to the whole world. The whole world's heard it because it was no longer blinded. Before, everyone was blinded. They couldn't see, nor hear, nor understand the plan of God at all until after the resurrection of Christ. So now we have the resurrection of Christ, and now we have this good news that is coming out. So if you stay rooted and grounded in the faith of Christ and in the gospel, what is going to happen? It's going to make sure you're born again. It's going to make sure you're reconciled. No, that's not the subject. The subject is, and you who were sometimes alienated and enemies in your mind. If you understand the gospel, you're not going to ever be alienated from God again in your mind, because it's impossible to be alienated from God in fact. That's not even possible, because Jesus secured that. Jesus acquired that. God and Christ worked this all out before even the foundations of the world. And now the continuation in the gospel and in the faith of Christ, the effect of it is that it is going to keep your mind settled in the fact that you are at peace with God, you are at one with God, and the whole world is at one with God. Staying in the faith doesn't make sure you get to heaven. Staying in the faith makes sure you stay sane. Stay in the faith, rooted and built up in the gospel. That what the gospel says doesn't get you redeemed. You got redeemed before the gospel was ever shared with anybody. But now the gospel is that incredibly powerful renewing of the mind and the saving of the soul. And if you continue in the faith, rooted and grounded and settled, and be not moved away from the hope of the gospel, which you have heard, and which was preached to every creature which is under heaven, wherefore I, Paul, am made a minister, who now rejoice in my suffering for you, and fill up that which was behind of the afflictions of Christ in my body for his body's sake, which is the church. This is more than we can really get to, but I'm going to take a shot at it before I go here. What in the world is Paul talking about? How does Paul fill up the sufferings that were left behind of the work of Christ? Paul, you arrogant fool, what are you talking about? But you see, we've got to look at this in context. Jesus suffered for reconciling the whole world. Paul suffered for telling people about it. He's saying that the suffering that he went through, and he's acknowledged his suffering almost through every letter that he wrote. So when Paul says in this very powerful, he said, I rejoice, who now rejoice in my suffering. Now he says, I'm suffering for you. But is Paul's suffering bringing you salvation? No more than the gospel brings you that. Is Paul's suffering bringing you redemption? No, Paul's suffering is not bringing you redemption. It's bringing you salvation to your mind. Paul had to suffer for this, folks. Paul suffered, and let me tell you, I know at whose hands he suffered also. He named them by name. He called them out, and he had no hesitation in doing this. Paul had a boldness about his presentation that he was not going to let the gospel fall into the oblivion of religion ever again. It was never going to fall into that you got to keep the law, that God is still judging people, or that sin still exists. Paul committed his life to that. And he says that he suffered for it and had the audacity to say that he was filling up that which was left behind. Now, you've never heard a preacher teach on this. I can guarantee you they skim over it because they don't know the context nor how in the world that that Paul could fill up the sufferings that were left behind of Christ. Jesus left something undone? No, Jesus left nothing undone. But now, let me tell you what, we have to, and I can tell you, the people sharing the gospel and this ministry has suffered for being able to tell people the completed work of the cross. Now, what we do does not get you redeemed. Nothing we do. Every person I meet is redeemed already. But when you go around in a religious world telling people they're already redeemed, you're undermining everything about the religious structure of organized Christianity. And we have suffered for it. Now, I've not suffered nearly what Paul suffered. Let me tell you, I'm doing fine. But compared to, one might call it suffering. As long as I agreed with that doctrine, I was well on my way to making several millions of dollars a year and would be doing that at this very moment. But I don't count that suffering, folks. Let me tell you something. We are so glad to be able to share this gospel with you. It is powerful. It is wonderful. We're going to close out here. We're in the pledge drive right now. Jeff Robertson is calling you this month instead of me. Isn't that amazing? I gave him the worst month in our history to take over pledge drive, but he's getting through it, and you guys are being kind and generous. Let me tell you, Kenneth Copeland got on just this past week and threatened all of his followers. He threatened them and told them that now is not the time to stop giving to your church. Now is not the time to stop giving. You should give more now. Your seed is, he went nuts. He went berserk. Good God, folks, let me tell you something. If you are having a hard time making ends meet, then stop contributing to this ministry. Please do not let your lives suffer because of a previous commitment that you made to give to this ministry on a monthly basis. We appreciate that. We love you and we respect you. But don't ever think that we're going to sit here and insist that you continue with your financial commitment in the face of severe loss. We love you, and we really do mean it. And don't forget, you get that mind saved. Keep it saved on a daily basis, and don't depart from the faith of Christ or the hope that there is in the gospel. Love you guys.